Today I'm speaking with Russell Rose. He's my own supervisor too. I've been working with him since 2016. He's a body-mind relational psychotherapist. He's been in the field since 1996. I have some very interesting questions to ask Russ today. Hi, Russ.
Hi, Omar. Nice to see you again. It's only 5 years that we've been working together. I thought it was longer than that. It's funny, isn't it?
Six. So we've been working
Six.
since 2016. Yeah,
I feel like I've known you for a decade. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. That's
All
a good
right.
thing.
Absolutely. So Russ, the first thing I'm very interested in is I know that in your work you work a lot with trauma, loss, grief. How do you see the process of change when you find people in stuck places? And I know that a lot of times when I've inquired from you, you'd say, "Oh, well, this is a long-term client. You might be working with them for a while." So how do you see the process of change?
Process of change. I mean, okay. Um, where to start? Like, I mean, there's different types of change. Obviously, there's incremental change and there's more radical, transformative change. I think with the deeper ingrained patterns of change that we want to elicit in our clients. I think first off, Omar, I think it's good to for us to recognise that the psyche always wants to change. There is a natural developmental process, and I think the psyche wishes to be on that surfboard. Wishes to
Mhm.
liberate us from our wounds, from our patterns. We still got this kind of post-enlightenment kind of idea that we're sort of machines really, and if the machine's broken, then the expert therapist needs to kind of dive in with a set of tools and fix it. But it's not
Mhm.
really true. It's not really true. That's just a kind of a Newtonian kind of Cartesian um habitual stuck position really. I think if we recognize, I think it's so important that if we recognize that the psyche always wants to change, is driven to change, driven to relieve us of our wounds and relieve us of our inhibitions, relieve us of our adaptations, and to liberate us into a freer, more expansive vision of life. Okay. And of course, it's that thing that brings clients to therapy. It's that thing that made
Mhm.
people like you go and try and become therapists and so on and so on. So the problem happens though is that in order to liberate ourselves from our wounds, we have to re-experience them, right? Which is why we try to do that
Mhm.
in a therapeutic environment, in a contained space, rather than I don't know, rather than just completely repeating our patterns over and over and over again with relationships. We go into a therapeutic relationship where we have that containment, which can allow us to see it on a nuanced level or in a relational contained level. So we have to re-experience it. Now, the trouble is here is the psyche is also driven to protect us from our pain. People use the word ego in a quite derogative way, really, but
Mhm. Mhm.
ego, the ego's position is to protect us from ever feeling that pain again, which is why we have these kind of primary wounds. And then we have these very complex adaptations that which we call defenses, which again is kind of slightly derogatory word for protections that
Mhm.
are inclined to protect us from feeling that pain again. So now what we have here is this drive to re-experience the pain so we can be liberated from it, and a drive to never experience that pain again. So we've got this very, very fundamental conflict. Now, I think this is an interesting one from the very beginning of therapy, because of course the drive that brings the client to therapy is the wish to be liberated, to be free of all this pain, trauma, stuckness. And of course, what goes into the shadow straight away from the very first day of therapy, of course, is the bit of the client that doesn't want to change, that never wants to change, wants to keep things exactly as they are, or almost entirely exactly as they are, maybe a little bit of change, nothing too painful. So we've always had this fundamental conflict, I think, in therapy and between therapist and client. So notably, we try and build a working alliance, right? So we start off with therapy, try and build a working alliance with our client. Now, that working alliance generally isn't let's go in there with a knife and cut open the wounds. It generally is about, building some sense of safety and relationship and trust and this, that, and the other. And of course, in order to do that, we have to collude with the adaptations, not with the wound
Mhm.
itself. We tend to build a relationship with our client from the very beginning, which is moving us away from the deepest pain. And then, once we have a solid enough working relationship, we can kind of go in there and start to unravel things. So it's always this movement of collusion,
Mhm.
both with the client, with themselves, and between the therapist and the client. There's always this wish to change and this wish not to change. So when we have this stuck place, I think we it's useful to see it in both positions, from both angles. And my own experience is that until we carry both positions and honor both positions without privileging one over the other, we don't get change. That's when we get change. When we hold the tension between those two positions. And of course, this is difficult again in therapy, because a client comes in not wanting to have their resistance honored. They come in wanting to be liberated, right? And our job as therapists, and it's very easy for us to occupy, certainly for me, to occupy kind of archetypes of, the knight in shining armor, or the rescuer, or the deep sea diver that plunges into the manhole, into the sewer, and discovers the wounded child and saves them, and that, all those kind of archetypes we're kind of, I'm driven by. I'm driven by. And instead, to honor the extent to which we should resist our own liberation alongside the wish to initiate a liberation. I think it's the tension between those two poles that really allows change to happen. And I think if we move this into a more modern context of so, for example, in physics, if you start thinking of the human psyche as being a complex system. Now, a complex system has its own rules, right? We still like to imagine really that we can go in there with our clever analysis, and we can open up the wound, and everything just happens. But in a complex system, you can influence a complex system, but you can't control it. And your primary way of working with it is to hold exactly that tension, the tension between the habitual position, which is the adaptation to the wounds, and the new emerging position, which is, in this context, is the wish to be liberated from our pain, to re-experience it, to reenact, is to hold those two back. When we hold those two places, we take the complex system towards the edge of chaos, it's called. And at the edge of chaos, spontaneous reorganization of the system. That's true in the human psyche, in the weather, in all complex systems. So I think we have to honor both positions. That's how we initiate change. And that's how we work with the stuck place too. We work at the level of why it is that we wish to be stuck.
And that's one of the bigger things I benefit in consulting with you, that how you're able to frame things within that complexity, rather than in simplifying it, and in terms of just maybe things that people are coming to us and saying, well, what do we do here? Instead of the doing, it becomes more of that understanding, that what are even those parts that we're working with. So I have a question related to that, which is in one of the deeper layers, and I'd imagine that in the South Asian context, there's always that trauma layer of the post-colonial legacy. And I also want to know about that, as well as the intergenerational layer of trauma that, in my work with you, a lot of times that we've been able to just identify that while I'm speaking with you about a client, there's a deeper layer of a family member that you're able to uncover, a deeper layer a few generations ago, which might possibly be there. Help me understand both the theory as well as
right, yeah,
how you see that.
Sure. I mean, first of all, just to say, I find working with the intergenerational level way easier with Pakistani therapists than with non-Pakistani therapists. And I think there's a much probably because the extent to probably the problem is in the solution, but there's a much deeper sense of family, of course, and quite a knowledge of family, and so I've always found it much easier to work on that level. I think the thing with the intergenerational level, Omar, is to recognise from the beginning that that we do carry intergenerational pain and trauma and wounds and patterns. We have to. There's no other way, and it's kind of interesting, really, that we ever, when did we begin to wonder that we don't? I mean, on a very simple cause and effect level, my father shouts at me, so I shout at my son, or you reverse it. My father shouted at me, so I reverse that and never raise my voice. Now I'm still bringing up my child within the context of my own trauma. I've just reversed it. Well, I never even raised my voice, right? So it's the same thing, really, just with it's a different side of the coin. So there's a very simple cause and effect level there, but also, I mean, for me, in the same way, I think you can look at a subjective human being and think, our life is about a process of development. I think the same is true for a bloodline. I think the same is true for a culture. I think the same is true for the species. We're continuously moving against our will, often in a trajectory that's a process of development, which I think includes inevitably the embodiment and the resolution of intergenerational, I'm going to say patterns more than just wounds. We always focus on wounds, but actually patterns, not just wounds. I mean, often something which causes us more difficulty isn't necessarily a wound. You know, for example, being overloved isn't necessarily a wound, but it can be a pattern that inhibits our growth. So there's different levels. There's obviously the cause and effect level. You know, your granddaddy shouts at your daddy shouts at you shout at your son. There's an obvious, simple cause and effect level. But I think there's the more embodied level, which I think happens through, I mean, on a theoretical level, happens really through right brain to right brain attunement, really, the right hemispheric brain to right hemispheric brain attunement. There's lots of work on this now, Alan Shaw and Damasio and all sorts of people now who, neuroscience is full of this now, how it is that we communicate on a non-verbal level, you know, how it is that we embody each other on a non-verbal level. And it's basically about right brain to right brain attunement and corresponding somatic processing. Now, it's interesting this again, Omar, because it's like, you know, when did we begin to imagine that we don't do this? You know, we like to ask questions about why we do this, but we forget sometimes to ask, when did we imagine that we don't? You know, because of course it's so entirely embodied in our cultural process up until, you know, a certain point in cultural history when we decided that we're all kind of psychological islands, and we, you know, the only thing we know about each other is what we actually narratively tell each other. But of course, we all know as psychotherapists that isn't true. We all, you know, every psychotherapist knows that feeling of, you know, oh, I'm really carrying my client with me. I've really got my client's stuff, you know, and it's quite interesting to say, well, you know, okay, but if you're feeling it, then it's your stuff too. It's not just your client's stuff, it's your stuff too. But that's always very obvious things. And but the mechanism by which that happens is, we know that mechanism, we're familiar with it, right? You know, you're with a friend having a beer or whatever, a cup of coffee, and he's very angry, and you walk away feeling some sense of anger from him. We recognize those kind of mechanisms because they happen on infinitely subtle levels too. You've got the right brain to right brain attunement. It's been interesting that I mean, there's a lot of stuff around bonding now. I mean, quantum entanglement is an interesting thing. Quantum entanglement says that if you take two subatomic particles that are once bonded, if you separate them, they'll remain forever responsive to each other. One spins this way, the other one will spin that way instantly. And there could be billions of miles apart. So they respond to each other faster than the speed of light, which is impossible, according to Einstein, right? So it's impossible if they're two separate things. It's impossible. But of course, if you see them as the same thing, but spatially distanced, then it's not impossible. So you apply that principle, and it's more than a metaphor. There's been lots of experiments about this, about how it is that bonded people, and by bonded, I don't necessarily mean deeply bonded, but we start to bond within 30 seconds or something of each other. We start to co-organize energetically. We now start to look at that principle here that, you know, as you respond, so do I respond. We start to co-respond off each other because we're internalizing each other as a matter of nature. Matter of nature, this is how we do things. And, you know, if we look back in history, I mean, when did we decide that we were separate islands, or we're separate from each other or from our generations? And I guess probably the development of individuality, which is I mean, if you look at the paintings in ancient Egypt 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, everyone looks more or less the same, right? Paintings in ancient Greece, people look more or less the same. It's only really about sort of 6th, 7th century BC classical Greece that you start to see individual characteristics clearly viewed. So that's the birth of the individual, really. So it's only been what's that, 600? That's like, you know, 2,500 years or something. The human being's been around for at least 200,000 years in the form that we now recognize. So for maybe like 4% of our existence, we've seen ourselves as individual islands. But prior to that, we didn't. You know, we had a very, very different experience. So on one hand, there's all the neurology of neurobiology of right brain to right brain attunement and the subtle reading of body languages and nuanced energy and so on. On the other hand, I think it's really useful to, in answering that question, to consider why we even need to ask the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I'm thinking of some of my work with you where just these communicational patterns where there's something that I'm experiencing, and you've been able to experience that, and you've been able to call it out, and that's when I become aware of that. I want you to just highlight some of that for people who are not therapists or who are not familiar with, but I mean, for me, it was absolutely magic the first time around when I started experiencing that with you, especially across a screen. But how does that work? And especially with you call out that this is sort of that infant part or that really infantile part to the client that's leaving something with you, which then you're able to identify for me. Shed
Well,
some light
it's
on that, please.
all right, God, I'll try. Because you've got the cause and effect level of you
Mm,
have certain nuanced body patterns which I read, but I think it's much more than that. And of course we know that, don't we? When I start thinking about Omar, and then Omar rings me.
mm,
Okay.
mm, mm,
No, what a coincidence. I've just been thinking,
mm,
and of course we have a language now which is coincidence, right? Rather
mm,
than thinking, well, okay, I was thinking about him because he was thinking about me, and so we contacted each other. So there's definitely an energetic level here. And I too have been slightly surprised since I started working online to the extent to which this does
mm,
translate
mm,
energetically across thousands of miles instantly in deeply unconscious patterns. Okay, so right, let me talk about enactment a little bit then. So I
mm,
think, our wounded patterns, we have these deeply embedded wounded patterns. We then have these complex adaptations that protect us from experiencing the wounded patterns again. Now, as I said earlier, I think there's this drive for the wounded pattern to reveal itself. Now, a
mhm,
wounded pattern has many characteristics, but two central ones, of course, are that it's relational,
mhm,
usually, because patterns generally are relational, and that it's unconscious because it's been dissociated, right? It's away from our. So as it comes up, as it re-arises into the psyche, which of course is our job as psychotherapists to create a container whereby that can happen. It comes up with two essential qualities. One is it's unconscious. We're not really aware of it, particularly even if we know the general narrative, we're not aware of its content, and it's relational. Now, therefore, it has to arise unconsciously and it has to arise relationally. That's its nature. It has to start to happen between us.
mhm,
Now, so and the extent to which it's not contained and it's not envisioned and contained by the individual is the extent to which it will start to play out in the relationship between the therapist and the client. And the extent to which that's not contained and envisioned is the extent to which it then starts to play out between the therapist and the supervisor. And of
mhm,
course, that becomes a little bit easier to work with now because I'm not as embedded in the process as you are with your client.
mm,
So we should be able to contain a little bit more than perhaps you can necessarily contain with your client. So this is its very energetic nature.
mm,
And now it's hard to describe exactly how this is theoretically because there's some. It does imply, of course, that there's an energetic field that binds the human being, which I certainly do believe. I don't know to what extent that's been conceptually accepted. I know there's David Bohm, the physicist, certainly sees. He talks about the the explicit and the implicit universe. The explicit universe is the one in which everything's separate, basically, is manifested into separateness, and the implicit universe is where everything is basically a sea of energy,
mm.
which makes everything kind of unified and separate, which I think is rather beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, and in my experience in working with you, I don't feel that I'm losing the plot here when I'm saying that. Well, look, it sounds like that there's this client who's just trying to get in touch with me, or there's this client who continues to sort of leave me with this sort of guilt or this pain, and rather than that being seen and then something that might even be pathologized, that's seen in that energetic relational field where it sort of disentangles it in some ways. We even get some sort of a language to understand what the client is trying to communicate in some pre-verbal infantilized state.
Absolutely, and it's got this magical kind of enchanted level of it. I mean,
Mm,
we of course use the word enchanted because we don't really understand it, but
mm,
whereby to what extent am I now the client? To what extent what is happening in me
mm,
is now
mm,
of the client? But then, if it's of the client, then how come it's happening in me? Which that now starts to challenge my idea of what the self is. Is the self now such a clear, solid, separate Russell, or is it
mm,
now Omar and Omar's client? And hold on a second, now I'm not quite me. I'm me, Omar, and Omar's client. And if I'm Omar's
mm,
client, then I'm Omar's client's intergenerational
mm,
trauma. And
mm,
suddenly, and I love this feeling. I think it's a really I think it's a wonderful. It's something I often will talk to new therapists about. Just practice surrendering to that experience, because it took me a few years to really surrender to it. And when I did, I just thought, what a magical experience this is, of how
Mm.
interconnected and unified everyone really is. I had a lovely example of it a while ago, actually. Of I was talking to a client. I've been working with him for ages, and they were sort of touching around these kind of I knew that she'd been abused without her saying so. I just had this feeling. I always had this feeling she'd been sexually abused, and she sort of kept tiptoeing around it, and we never quite got there. We're talking one day, and I called her by the wrong name. I've been working with her for over a year, this woman.
Mm.
I called her Sarah or something. It's like, she's like, what? Really pissed off with me, as you can imagine. I'm really sorry. Anyway, I was going to kind of just, oh my God, what a silly mistake. I felt so guilty. I thought, God, how come I'm feeling this guilty? What is this about? This is bizarre. So I stuck with my guns. I just wrote, what does Sarah mean? Nothing. It must mean something. No one. Don't know anyone called Sarah. Never knew anyone called Sarah.
Mm.
And I was like, God, am I just enacting the kind of guilty parent who won't own up to making a mistake, which is certainly a theme, and that was the easiest way I could have gone with her. Was she certainly did have one parent who never owned up to anything. I thought, I'm just enacting this place. Stuck with it, and it kind of popped out of her. She said, "Oh my God!" And as a small infant, she had a life-size doll, which she called by the name that I had called her, Sarah.
Oh wow.
I think, and this was the girl she went to, and the whole story came out. This is the life-sized friend she had, who she talked to when she'd been abused by two or three members of her family.
Oh wow.
So how that happened. This is about emergence, isn't it? How this emerged in me, this in my own body and my own mind. This word, one single word, which opened up a whole story. But it could have been, of course, just a guilty moment of being a bad daddy, or a bad therapist.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, like you said, that for a new therapist, or even for me going through that process and entrusting this part of myself, not only just those images, but sometimes those visions, that you're working with the client and something suddenly pops up, a thought, an image, a feeling in your body, and being able to trust that, bring it up, sticking to it, and more often than not, something emerges from it. And if something doesn't emerge, well, there might be something relational to that.
Absolutely, and you start thinking about it in terms of the psyche's conflict position to liberate through experience, but also to inhibit experience. Then we can see it goes into one or the other. And I think, well, I mean, if we start from a position of, well, why on earth would I have thought this? If you start from that position, I must have thought this for some reason. Is it just because I'm an idiot? Well, no. Is it because I don't know her name? No, I've known her for a year. I know her name. It must mean something. It must mean something. And it's actually something that I've noticed in with Pakistani therapists quite a lot. Actually, is they sort of seem to really love that enchanted area of psychology. And with some of my UK supervisors, not all, but some have been much more kind of like push into it, go into it, look into it, come on, look at it, and once you've proved it enough, they'll go with it.
I actually want to know a bit more about that. I know that in the recent years you've been working with a lot of Pakistani supervisees, Pakistani clients. How I know that's a generalization, but how do you see some themes that emerge? I want to know about Pakistani supervisees as well as Pakistani clients. What are some things that, from outside of the cultural vantage point, when you're looking at Pakistanis, what do you see?
Oh God, so much. I could talk for hours on this subject, I think. There's lots of things. I think well, one thing that's very interesting, of course, is it seems like about 90% of Pakistani psychotherapists are women. It doesn't seem like 90% of clients are women. So that's an interesting, I always notice this. It's interesting that a lot of men are recognizing that things aren't working and are seeking help. And what they're seeking help from, they're seeking help from, the women seem to be, by and large, charged with being the custodians of the cultural process. If something is happening in Pakistan, which I think it is, it's the women who are being charged with managing this, more so than men. I mean, of course, it's you. I mean, we did this group the other week, and there was 25 odd people there. You were the only practicing therapist. There's another guy there who.
Russ, can I just pause you for a moment? And this might be a very interesting learning opportunity for people who are seeing this now. While you're talking about this, there's a shooting sort of headache that just goes through my head. And I don't know what that might be about. The moment you're talking about how what men are carrying and how women are custodians of, it's- there's something that changes in my body. So I thought that I'd just stop for that
Yeah, thank
moment.
you.
Yeah.
Do you know what moment it was that
It might
made
have
this
been
happen?
about women being the cultural custodians of the process. And I just noticed a shooting pain that went through my head.
Was it what emotion would you attach to it? Anything obvious? Were you angry with me for discounting you, or
I can't say that. But something
no?
about, maybe it's something more of at that meta level, at the cultural level, something about men and women. And while you're talking about that, I carried some of that. I don't know why that might be.
Is it about men being in pain?
Maybe. Could be that. Could be
You
that.
know, I
Yeah.
think it's an interesting one in Pakistan. I have
Mm,
this conversation occasionally, which of course,
mm,
the patriarchal society, which is always kind of I'm always slightly uncomfortable with, because of
mm,
course, in even naming it as a patriarchal society,
mm,
we're giving it the power, right? And
mm,
an institution is different from dynamically, and of course, dynamically, as we all know, a lot of women in Pakistan carry an awful lot of influence and power, right? It's just in a
mm,
very, you know,
mm.
uh,
And the
horizontal.
polarity that's happening with me while you talk about that power is that I feel a lot of that pain. There's a lot of
Yeah.
that pain and there's a lot of that hurt, and I can especially see that welling up to my eyes. So that might be something around this piece then.
Well, I think that's what so I'm just getting to.
Mm,
I think it's because because alongside this idea that men carry all the power, which of course is institutionally
mm,
true,
mm,
dynamically it's not true,
mm,
is the idea that men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. That's the implicit assumption.
mm,
Um, However, one might argue that that's the implicit assumption. So, of course, in that recognition that we now need the women to manage the process, which of
mm,
course is some kind of, it's not a reversal of patriarchy. It's just
mm,
I don't even know how we'd explain it. It's just necessary, isn't it? We can end up denying the pain, the masculine pain in the culture, and I think that's what's
mm,
interesting. Is yes, the women are generally being charged with managing this process,
mm,
90%, but not 90% of the clients. A lot of the clients come to therapy and men are in pain in
mm,
Pakistan. I
mm,
do. I think the masculine pain in Pakistan
mm,
is under attended to.
mm, mm. And I think that everything we've been talking about the past 20, 25 minutes, just this moment, could be a wonderful example of how just talking about something in the deeper sense, there's something that's happening. And while we're there, you're able to either identify that for me. So, I mean, I may not have been able to put some words to that, what just happened, but now I don't have that pain and that was going up my head. I have some language to understand that experience, that what it was.
But I feel upset now. It's
Mm,
really odd. And you've stopped having the pain. I feel upset now. I've got
yeah.
and it's like a sort of. I almost feel divided in two. There's
Uh,
this wall of pressure coming
mm,
from behind me.
mm, mm,
Of this kind of, this
mm,
unattended to masculine pain. When I said those words,
mm.
it opened something right up at me. I can feel it now.
And I think that the word custodian, there's something about that. And I know that in our working, a lot of times we've reflected on what it means to be male practitioners, what it means to be working from a lot of my clients to me and my working with you. And there's something to that. And like you said, we could have a long conversation about this, but Um, I want to know a bit more about Pakistani
Yeah.
supervisees as well. That when you're
Yeah.
working with them, um, how
Yeah.
would you differentiate that cultural group of therapists with maybe some of the other cultural groups of
Well,
therapists you
first
work
of all, I think as I touched on,
with?
Omar, God, I feel really affected here. As I touched on earlier, the enchantment level is very exciting. How quickly I find Pakistani therapists are able to step into
Mm,
a deeper energetic sense of process. Including that kind of more what we might imagine as magical or enchanted process. The other thing, of course, which is pretty obvious, well, there are two things actually, and one might be the consequence of your training. You've got the therapy works training. You've also had a lot of influence from Michael Soth, of course, who's a
mm,
wonderful theorist. Is how processed people are. People seem to be very processed and to love process work. They love the idea of being in a process. And the stuff that we're talking about, I find Pakistani supervisors are far more excited
mm,
about and
mm,
intuitively understanding of than perhaps therapists from other countries. Not all, obviously. I think one thing that has struck me over the years, I used to think of it as an inferiority complex, thinking, oh, guys, you've got this kind of
Mm,
post-colonial inferiority complex,
mm,
which has always struck me as ironic because it's very clear to me that the average Pakistani therapist is extremely intelligent. I mean,
mm,
in my limited experience, way more intelligent than necessarily how you'd see uh, young trainees from other countries, right? I
mm,
think, but what I stopped thinking of it as a inferiority complex. I mean, I think there is some inferiority complex. There is, whether
mm,
it's women to men or brown to white or whatever it is. But it's also kind of a disguised. It's not superiority. It's right for an extremely radical example. Just to make a point of principle, I remember reading
mm,
a guy who was he was on a slave plantation in America. This is 1800s, whatever. And he made some reference to most of my day is spent trying not to reveal how intelligent I am, right? Because then I'm in trouble. And I have, and I'm obviously in a much diluted sense of that. I have that sense sometimes, and I wonder about this in a post-colonial context, from particularly from women supervisees in Pakistan, where it takes me sort of a year to think, oh wow, you're really intelligent. Wow, you've kind
mm,
of been hiding this from me a little bit, you
mm,
know. Now I
mm,
recognize, now I see a look in the eye now. I think I can see that now where you're kind of camouflaging it slightly. Whether that's a gender thing or it's a post-colonial thing, I'm not quite sure.
mm, mm,
But certainly, I mean, Pakistan as a territory has got a long history of being invaded, right? I mean, obviously you had the British colonial empire, which is what 1847 or 8 or something. But then there was the East India Company 100 years before that, which I know wasn't
mm,
exact colonialism, but same difference probably. But even going back, I mean, is it Alexander the Great invaded the territory that's Pakistan back in, I mean, 320 BC, 326 BC maybe? And
mm,
that's an interesting one for me. You know, this colonial context didn't begin in 1847 or even 1747 with the East India Company. It began right back then with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's teacher was Aristotle, the Greek philosopher.
mm,
Now, Aristotle, aside from being a genius, was also quite the racist. Right? He didn't
mm,
like you a lot. He thought you're all heathens,
mm,
and was quite, I mean, psychopathically disparaging about brown people. Basically, I don't think he used that term, but basically anyone who wasn't, Athenian or Macedonian or Roman white was a kind of a heathen. So as Alexander the Great moved into the whole of what is now Pakistani territory, of course, he brought with him not only the imposition of European culture, but the imposition of racism, which is inherent
mm.
um, within the whole colonial occupation. And I think this inferiority complex is, of course, fundamentally racist, right? That's what it is. It's a racism. I'm less than you,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and yeah,
And that's very interesting how being able to work there's something about this conversation. It changed my energy. I don't know
mm,
if I'm still carrying what you and I were talking about maybe 5 or 8 minutes ago, how I felt relieved, something deflated in me, but you ended up carrying some of that. But now I just felt energy shift in my body. Actually leave my body. There's a lot lesser energy in my body now.
oh really? A lot less energy in your body.
Yeah. It's almost
Is
like
that
I'm becoming cold. It's the room became a lot colder for me.
well? You said cold, but you clenched your fists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we having a colonial face off here? Is there something in this?
Yeah.
I just had this sudden feeling that you were standing your ground against me or something.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That
I'm
that
not
wasn't
I'm not too sure about that, but that's what in terms of my energy here, that's what changed.
right. Just interesting. You went cold, but clenched your
Mm,
fists. It just
mm, mm,
like
mm.
it felt
Yeah.
confrontational.
Yeah. Yeah. We can spend a lot of time exploring that.
Well, I mean, and
Just as a snippet, I think this is so
okay.
interesting. For anyone who's exploring this space, just now, the unique work that you bring in, the complexity that you bring in, all of these layers. I mean, and when I was listening to it, I was just reflecting on maybe for me as a therapist, I may be stuck at just that layer that's post-colonial, but all the way that it goes even way further back than that, and what we're bringing into any field at any given point, and all of the experience that can just be stopped, and we can just try to bite on and consume that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially if we start to imagine that we've got
Mm,
sort of a nice idea of time, haven't we now? You know, time used to
mm,
be just night and dark for people, then it
mm,
became seasonal,
mm,
and then,
mm,
then it became following this, astrological,
mm,
um, and now it's more like clockwork, really, past, present, future, nice, neatly defined. If you imagine that everything, your entire psychological history is in this moment. My entire psychological
mm,
history is in this moment. Here it is, which means also more my intergenerational and cultural, all your intergenerational,
mm,
so you meet here on many, many different levels,
mm,
which dissolves time. Of course, it means that that every moment you've ever been and has ever been in your lineage is on some level or another
mm,
available here. Which perhaps was why I just, as you were talking, it's funny. I noticed something in me which I didn't like, which I thought, oh, I feel apologetic. I thought that's what I'm
mm.
feeling. When you went cold and
Ah,
had your fist up, I had a
ah,
strange feeling. I thought, what is that? I couldn't get my hand. It's only when I was talking, I thought,
mm,
oh, I feel apologetic. And I hate all that kind of,
mm,
people
mm,
we like to apologize. We like to apologize to Pakistan for the racism that we did,
mm,
200.
mm,
It always feels hollow to me. It feels like political
mm,
and hollow. It doesn't really mean anything. Like, change it in the present. You can't change the
mm.
past. You can change the present. You can have an apology, but these kind of, it gets a bit.
And Russ,
So
I'm now gathering the words that I have from my experience. I think I lost my grounding just for a moment in all of those layers. So when I hear you say right now, that's not the layer where I was. Maybe the layer I was in a lot of those layers I needed to find myself back, which is that I wasn't situating myself in any of those other layers. I wanted to come back here as a therapist. Whereas there's all of those, the
okay.
post-colonial, the racist, the Macedonian, the Alexander the Great. I lost myself somewhere there. I needed to be back here as a therapist. And I think that the moment you called that out, that helped me come back to my body.
Right, and
Mm,
look at the parallel process there. You
mm,
lost
mm,
yourself
mm,
amongst the Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, the Athenians, and
mm,
this. You lost
mm,
yourself,
mm,
and of course, that's what happened. That's what happens with colonial occupation, isn't it? Is
mm,
the territory being occupied threatens to lose itself. It
mm,
loses its pure identity, and that's what I found
mm.
with Pakistani therapists who kind of are pretending to be less intelligent with me than they really are, because because
Yeah.
they've lost. Well, no, I don't think they've lost it. I think they've kept it, but
Mm,
they've kept it within. You
mm,
know, safely within, rather than necessarily letting it out. And I noticed with the people I've been working with for a few years now, it's very different. It's very
mm,
different. They're much more bullish and evocative to me, and expect me to know what's happening. 2 or 3 particularly expect me to know what's happening in Pakistan. Well,
mm,
of course you've heard about this, haven't you? With a slightly kind of, you're working with us, so you ought to know, which is what I
mm,
think is entirely fair
mm,
enough.
mm, mm.
So on. Yeah.
And I'm
But
I'm
anyway,
I'm reconnecting with some of those other layers, including that of my own vulnerability as a therapist, as a professional, being very mindful of this, including again, I promised myself that I'll try to limit this to 30 minutes, which we've probably overshot that. So I'm going to ask my last question, which I know a lot of Pakistanis especially are interested in. That's a question that's posed to me a lot. I want to pose that to you as someone who's from outside of our cultural group. And I know that a lot of times Pakistanis, when they work with therapists who are white, one of the problems they have with them is that they generally will find that intolerance with them, that let's say someone who's in an abusive relationship, or someone who's finding it difficult with a mother-in-law who's narcissistic, a white therapist is saying, well, why are you still in that relationship? Or I
yeah.
don't know how I can help you in your sense of self, or in that individual self. Why are you still in that abusive situation? So I want to know about that, which is, how do you see that? And I know that some of your relationships with your clients, with your supervisees, they're not those fixing relationships that exit it, leave it, do that. How do you find yourself in those situations?
Oh, I mean, it's been really a deep learning curve, actually.
Mm,
Which I begun by feeling a bit stupid and arrogant, and thinking, oh my God, of course, arranged marriages. Oh my God, I hadn't thought about that.
mm,
Which I felt rather, when I remember when I first had that feeling. I can still remember it, actually, thinking, God, you arrogant bastard. You hadn't even connected to the culture enough to remember that this is a thing, right? So of course I had to, and of course for me
mm,
there was then about sort of then having to work with, of course, with my prejudice and thinking, and my habitual standpoints around such things, and trying to more deeply understand it, but more so energetically feel it. And I think it was one of my supervisees who went to some detail about how her parents had spent some years
mm,
really thinking about her, and I think about what she's like now, but what she's probably going to be like in 10 or 20 years time, and then trying to find a man who really befitted that particular image of this particular person. And that's when I started to think, oh, okay, this is not just some kind of awful imposition. You know, I'm sure it can be for some people, but I mean, spot relationships anywhere. I mean, my God, I mean, we can't sit on a higher ground here. I mean, you know, UK classically people get married because they fancy each other, and then 10 years later, when they have their first child, they realize that's not enough. So what's better and worse? I mean, you know, it's so once I got outside the moral response to that, I started getting into more into the energetic experience of that and allowed me to begin to touch on, and I mean just begin to touch on, in quite a humble way into the energetic system. And for example, a cause and effect again, you know, well, I've got a solution, why don't you just leave? Now, of course, it's quite nice to mature enough to drop below one's cause and effect solutions in therapy, because we know as therapists that solutions rarely work. I mean, a solution nearly always carries the problem, right? Carries a disguised version of the problem. Nearly, I mean, you see this through history as well, you know, like, you know, well, in the Enlightenment, I mentioned earlier, the Enlightenment, you know, condemned the church for burning people who disagreed with them, but then introduced the guillotine and chopped their heads off instead. So, you know, the solution to the problem, it carried the problem. You know, the Christian religion condemned the magic of the heathens, but then introduced miracles, which, you know, magic that only which deities can perform. So, what are we talking about?
Pakistanis, boundaries, difficult people, narcissistic
So
individuals.
yes, getting beyond the cause and effect solution model, which of course again is quite a white.
And there's something about this topic. I don't take this as a coincidence that you lost your stream of thought. I was also sort of just blanking out of this. There's something about this topic, and I in what we were talking about earlier in this interview, how as people who are looking at these social problems, or looking at maybe that whole cultural construction of that, there's something about this topic that was also making me blank out.
Well, I wonder if it's a mild association. I wonder if that's part of what we do when something is intractable and unbearable, but we can't escape. We dissociate in simple trauma language. If you can't fight, if you can't socially mediate, then you fight or flight. If you can't fight or flight, you freeze. And freezing involves counterpart of dissociation. So I guess that's what we're doing there. We're playing that out. You know, how do you leave? You can't leave something that you absolutely must leave. And I think there's been, I mean, it's an interesting, because I think it's also, whilst I accept that proposition, then there's an awful lot of people who cannot leave, and I think that's true. There's also, I've noticed a flow through people who, well, I can't leave, and I've taken the other bit of like, oh, okay, yeah, no, sure, of course you can't leave. It's taken a while for me to think, yeah, but hold on a second, is that exactly true? Oh, yeah, that is impossible. Well. And several times, well, okay, let's look at, you know, well, I couldn't possibly afford it. Okay, you're a full practice. I mean, you know, how much would it cost to rent a room? And suddenly, if I happen to know some people who have left abusive marriages and they have been able to, it's not easy. It's very difficult. So, of course, this idea that you can't leave is also quite an embedded habitual position, which has got a lot of truth to it, but it's not necessarily all true. So my counter-transferential response to that has been also problematic, and I kind of bowed down to my arrogance and thought, oh yeah, okay, what do I know? I just immerse yourself into their cultural experience and try and work it out from there. And then I had to recognize that I was doing the opposite of it, that my humility was also part of the problem, because part of what was needed here was, but is that true that you can't leave? It's actually true. And for some people, of course, it is true, but for some people, I think I've got a few faces in my head now, it's not true. They could.
And that's that blind spot that a lot of times in our own work, you've been able to sort of just, the moment you point that out and you ask simple questions such as, where does that come from, or who said that, or how is that what it is, or how did they know about this? Sort of there's more to it than just these being conclusions. Okay, and I think that even in how I was framing that question, I think that your answer sort of opens it up rather than offers a solution. I think that's very fair to the situation, that it's not really about what needs to be done, but it's about how people are seeing that. Is there more to it? What else is there?
And of course, that's the whole problem with all culture, really, of cultural development. Culture is very, rather like I was talking earlier about our own subjective process of change and don't change. Same with culture. Culture wants to stay the same, but it also is driven to change, and it has to change. I mean, I think there's an inherent spiritual process, and nature has an inherent process, and culture is driven to change because we're driven to change. And I think you can see that in Pakistan. There's a sort of a very, not just a fundamentalist, but a very middle road kind of embodiment of what is. We want it to be what it is, but we also need things to change. And of course, it's very hard to have both positions or to prioritize one over the other. So again, right back to the complexity theory thing, is somehow trying to hold both those positions. And so, of course, the difficulty with the post-colonial image is that I try and impose my position on the culture, or I take that apologist position where I don't impose anything on the culture at all. And somehow it's a tension between both, and my risk and the risk I have to run at upsetting people, of course.
And just looking back to this interview's process, it's very interesting. It's that for me, I didn't plan out these questions just in this way, but the very first thing I was inquiring about was the process of change, and maybe towards the end, somehow that question probably stayed with me. I mean, in my list of questions, that was meant to be the second or the third question, but somehow that could push to the last, which is, what do you do with that? Well, if you're working with someone who is in those really difficult places and they're coming to you, and somehow that tension between these two, the process of change, and where it's instead of solving the problem, it's more about redefining that, reframing that, opening that up. And I think that this is more than the lay public. I think it's going to be a very educational experience, especially for therapists listening to this. This has been wonderful. This has been more than what I planned for.
It's been more than that. I knew we'd have fun. We always have fun. Talk. I knew it was going to be very. I wasn't expecting quite the impact on me that it's had. I'm feeling quite physically affected. Really, in a really enjoyable way, actually.
This comes full circle for me too. I think we're probably energetically something shifted in me 20 minutes ago, and where I am now, I think it's more of that tingling. My hands are still a bit cold, but it's sort of that tingling in the rest of my body. Something has come full circle for me.
Hands a bit cold, but you've still got that fight in them.
I'll be thinking about that. Thank you so much, Russ.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. I'm glad we were able to do this.